Why was she the only one in the room who didn't look like she belonged? The men who had just walked in carried the air of danger and discipline. Their uniforms, pressed and dusted with the salt of training, seemed to radiate authority. They didn't even need to speak. You could feel the weight of their presence in how the room quieted, how the smell of oil and solder from Sarah's workbench suddenly seemed out of place against the scent of sweat and iron carried in from outside. She wasn't supposed to be here, at least that's what it felt like. She was just a civilian technician, hidden away at a corner workshop on Naval Base Coronado, fixing radios that others had broken. Nothing glamorous, nothing heroic, and yet now their lives might depend on her work. Her name was Sarah Martinez, 24 years old, quiet, a little shy. Most days she kept her head down, her hands buried in wires and circuit boards. She preferred it that way. She wasn't a soldier, she didn't carry a weapon. She didn't run drills at dawn or wear medals on her chest. She carried a small tool kit, a soldering iron, a notebook. That was her armor. But today was different. Because today, SEAL Team 7 had come for their gear. Radios, satellite phones, GPS units. All of it had sat on her bench for a week, broken, lifeless, demanding her attention. She had stayed late most nights, her fingers cramping under the weight of precision, her eyes burning from staring into magnified wires. One device, a GPS unit, had nearly defeated her. She had almost quit on it, almost told herself it wasn't her responsibility, but something in her refused. She had gone online, searched manuals, watched grainy videos at midnight, and in the glow of her desk lamp finally found the problem. A wire no wider than a strand of hair, disconnected from its antenna. She reattached it with trembling hands, tested it, and when it lit up with a signal, she felt something strange. Pride. Now those men stood in her workshop, their eyes scanning her work. The lieutenant moved first. Tall, broad-shouldered, his uniform neat but lived in. His eyes were sharp blue, the kind that didn't look away. He picked up one of the radios from her desk, turned it over in his hands, and pressed the buttons. His face didn't shift. No approval, no criticism, just silence. Sarah's palms grew damp. Her chest tightened. She had tested every single device twice. She knew they worked. But what if she had missed something? What if, out there in the wilderness or under fire, a signal cut out because of her? Would they remember her face when the silence came? One of the other men switched on the GPS. The screen lit, connected to the satellites overhead, and displayed their location instantly. He gave a short nod, almost a smile, then showed it to his teammate. Sarah caught the motion and felt a spark of relief, but still, the lieutenant hadn't spoken. She waited. And then finally, his eyes met hers. It wasn't what she expected. She thought she'd see judgment or at best indifference. Instead, she saw recognition, as if in that moment he understood something about her, her long nights, her nerves, the quiet way she carried herself. "Who fixed these?" His voice was steady, deep. Sarah swallowed hard. "I did, sir." It was barely more than a whisper. But once she started, the words came. She explained the faults she'd found, how the radios had loose connections, how the satellite phone's battery ports had corroded, how the GPS wire had come undone. At first her voice trembled, but as she spoke of the details, the soldering, the microscopic adjustments, her confidence grew. These were her battlegrounds, her weapons. She knew them better than anyone. The lieutenant listened, really listened. He didn't interrupt, didn't glance at the clock. He leaned closer, asked a question about the antenna, then another about the phone's encryption. Sarah answered each one carefully, feeling the heat of purpose rise inside her. By the time she finished, silence hung in the room again, and then one of the SEALs let out a low whistle. "Damn good work," he said. For the first time that day, Sarah allowed herself to breathe. The lieutenant set the GPS down, straightened, and gave her the smallest of nods. "Thank you." 2 words, that was all, but they landed heavier than metals. Sarah had never been thanked like that before. Not with the weight of respect, not with the tone of someone who knew exactly how much her effort mattered. She wasn't just the quiet girl in the corner fixing radios anymore. She was someone whose work could mean the difference between life and death. And then came the part she never expected. As they prepared to leave, the lieutenant turned back. For a moment his posture shifted, not just officer to civilian, not command to contractor, but human to human. And then, in a move so small yet so staggering, he gave her a salute. It wasn't theatrical. It wasn't for show. It was deliberate, precise, and real. Sarah froze. She wasn't military. She wasn't anyone to be saluted. She was just a technician in a workshop who happened to fix a broken wire. But the gesture wasn't about rank. It was about recognition. Her heart thundered in her chest. Something inside her shifted. Because in that moment, surrounded by solder fumes and silence, Sarah realized she had crossed a threshold. She wasn't just background anymore. She wasn't invisible. She mattered. And yet she didn't know what that salute would cost her, or what it would open. Because in the weeks ahead, she would learn that being noticed, being valued, carried its own dangers. That the weight of responsibility could break even the steadiest hands. But for now she held on to that single image. A SEAL lieutenant, sharp blue eyes fixed on hers, offering respect she never thought she'd earn. And in the quiet after they left, sitting alone in her workshop, she whispered to herself, almost as if afraid of the truth. My work, it actually matters. She didn't know then that those words would be tested, over and over, until they broke her, and rebuilt her into someone she never imagined she could be. Why did the silence feel heavier now? The workshop was the same humming lights, same shelves of radios and tools, same faint smell of oil and dust that clung to her clothes. Yet ever since that salute, the silence wasn't comforting anymore. It was restless. It pressed on her chest like an unanswered question. Sarah kept thinking about the lieutenant, Mike Thompson. His name had settled in her mind the way ink seeps into paper, quiet, irreversible. She remembered his steady gaze, the way he asked about her work with the calmness of someone who had seen storms but didn't let them shake him. And most of all, she remembered the salute. Her father would have called it impossible. A SEAL officer saluting a civilian technician. But it had happened. She could still see the sharp line of his hand, the flicker of respect in his eyes. It wasn't meant for the girl who hid behind broken radios. It was meant for the woman who had refused to quit until every piece of gear worked. But now the SEALs were gone. Out there, somewhere in the jagged Colorado mountains, training for missions no one talked about in the open. And Sarah was left with the silence. She tried to bury herself in work. Piles of old equipment came through the door, radios damaged by sand, radar components in need of calibration, even a broken encryption board that took her 2 days to troubleshoot. But none of it quieted the questions that gnawed at her in the late hours of the night. Were they safe? Did her repairs hold up? Was the GPS still glowing with life beneath the stars, guiding men through valleys where no light reached? Or had her soldering failed, leaving them stranded in fog and darkness? For the first time, Sarah understood the weight of Mr. Johnson's old words. Communication could mean the difference between life and death. Before, it had been a slogan, something repeated like a rule. Now it pulsed like a truth in her veins. She woke from dreams where radios cracked with static, where voices called for help but never broke through. And then one Thursday afternoon, the phone rang. The number on the screen was unfamiliar. Sarah almost didn't answer. Spam calls weren't rare, but something inside her stirred, a voice whispering that this wasn't random. She picked up. Martinez. Her heart froze. She knew that voice, steady, deep, the lieutenant. Yes, sir, she breathed, her voice betraying the tremor she tried to suppress. This is Lieutenant Thompson, calling from Colorado. The room tilted. She gripped the edge of her workbench, grounding herself. We've been running long-range recon drills, he continued. Your equipment hasn't just held up, it's exceeded every expectation. Sarah blinked, unable to form words. The radios are clear even in the valleys. The GPS, his tone shifted softer. The GPS saved our mission. Heavy fog rolled in. We were disoriented. That device guided us back to base. Without it, we might have been walking blind for hours. Sarah pressed a hand against her chest. Her heart hammered beneath her palm. "You saved us time, maybe even saved us, period," Thompson said. "I wanted you to know that." Her throat tightened. All those nights staring into circuits, all those quiet moments when she doubted if she mattered, they had led here, to this call, to this truth. "Thank you, sir," she managed. There was a pause on the line, then with a hint of warmth, "We'll bring you something back, a token of thanks." The line clicked off. Sarah remained frozen, the dial tone buzzing in her ear. She set the phone down gently as if afraid to break the moment, then buried her face in her hands. A rush of emotions surged through her: relief, pride, disbelief, fear. Her work had made a difference, a real difference. When the team returned days later, she was ready. She told herself she wouldn't look nervous this time, that she would meet their eyes without shrinking. And when they stepped into her workshop, sunburned and tired but smiling, something inside her steadied. They handed her a small plaque, carved wood, the seal insignia etched with precision, her name beneath it. It wasn't official. It wasn't decorated with ribbons or signatures. But it was theirs. A gesture from warriors who didn't waste words on things they didn't mean. Petty Officer Rodriguez clapped her shoulder, thanking her for the satellite phones. Jackson praised the radios, saying they worked better than when new. And the lieutenant, Mike, stood back, watching. When the others filed out, he lingered, his voice lowered. "We could use someone like you more often," he said. "Specialized projects, modifications, equipment that standard contractors don't touch." Sarah blinked. Her fingers curled against the edge of the bench. "Are you interested?" Interested. The word felt small compared to the storm inside her. She wanted to say yes. She also wanted to run. Her work here was safe, controlled, behind locked doors. Specialized projects meant risk, responsibility, mistakes that could cost lives. But then she remembered the salute, the plaque, the phone call that carried gratitude across the miles. She nodded, "Yes, sir." Mike's lips curved into something not quite a smile, but close. "Good, I'll recommend you." When he left, Sarah sat in her chair, staring at the empty doorway. Her world had just cracked open. For the first time, the silence of the workshop no longer felt like confinement. It felt like a beginning. That night she called her parents. Her father's voice carried pride so strong she could hear it over the static. Her mother's voice carried worry, as it always had, warning Sarah about the dangers of being too close to soldiers and secrets. But Sarah only listened with half an ear, because deep inside something had changed. She had been noticed, trusted, chosen. And though fear gnawed at her, she couldn't deny the truth. She wanted more. But Sarah didn't yet understand what that choice would demand of her, or how it would drag her from quiet benches and midnight repairs into a world where wires and circuits weren't just tools, but lifelines stretched thin against death itself. For now all she knew was this: the work mattered. And if the work mattered, then so did she. Why did the questions feel more personal than she expected? At first, Sarah thought the security clearance process would be routine, some forms, maybe a background check, nothing more. But within weeks, investigators were calling her old bosses, sitting in the living rooms of her childhood neighbors, speaking with professors she hadn't seen since college. They examined her financial history, her travel records, even who she spent time with. Sarah had never felt so exposed. At night, lying awake in her small apartment, she wondered if she had made the wrong choice. She wasn't cut out for this kind of scrutiny. She wasn't dangerous, wasn't hiding anything, but still, the feeling of being dissected lingered like a shadow. More than once, she picked up the phone to tell Lieutenant Thompson she was backing out, that she was fine being the quiet girl with the soldering iron tucked away in her workshop. But every time she stopped herself, because she could still hear his voice on that call from Colorado. The GPS saved our mission. If she walked away, what would that mean the next time? So instead, she pushed forward. The investigators asked endless questions. Do you owe money? Have you ever left the country? What websites do you use? Each one chipped at her sense of privacy until it felt like they knew her better than she knew herself. Even her parents in Texas called after being interviewed, her father chuckling at the thoroughness, her mother fretting over what Sarah was getting herself into. And through it all, Lieutenant Thompson kept showing up. Not often, not enough to draw attention, but enough. Some days he'd stop by the workshop asking how repairs were going. Other times he'd leave a manual on her bench, filled with dog-eared pages and notes scribbled in the margins. These might help, he'd say, before disappearing again. It wasn't grand, it wasn't obvious, but it steadied her. One afternoon, as she worked on a radar array, he leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, expression unreadable. How's it going? Slow, she admitted. Feels like I'm being measured. You are, he said simply. Sarah blinked. He didn't soften it, didn't sugarcoat. But, he added, his eyes catching hers, they don't measure you for what you've done. They measure you for what you might carry, and I trust you can carry it. The words lodged inside her like an anchor. 3 months later, the clearance came through. A plain envelope, stamped with government insignia, handed to her by the same lieutenant who had first saluted her. He set it down on her bench and said, almost quietly, "Welcome aboard." For a moment, Sarah couldn't breathe. Because this wasn't just paperwork. This was an invitation into a world few ever saw. A world where her hands and her mind would be trusted not just with wires, but with lives. Her first classified project was brutal. Underwater communication systems. Radios that could function even after being submerged in salt water. Standard gear broke down in minutes. Corrosion ate through circuits, seals cracked, signals died. But SEAL teams didn't wait for fair conditions. They went where they were needed, whether that meant mountains, jungles, or oceans. Sarah stared at the requirements and almost laughed. Radios weren't meant for that, not with their current designs. But then she remembered the plaque, the salute, the phone call, and she set her jaw. She spent weeks tearing down existing radios, redesigning their guts piece by piece. She studied marine-grade metals, corrosion-resistant seals, antenna systems that could withstand pressure. She ordered parts from suppliers she'd never heard of before, their names cloaked in government codes. And when she finally produced the first prototype, she thought it might hold. Testing proved her wrong. The seals dropped it into a saltwater tank. 10 minutes later, it died. Sarah watched from behind the glass, her stomach sinking. The water had found its way through the seals. She felt heat rise to her cheeks, shame clawing at her. I failed, she whispered to herself. But Thompson didn't scold her. He didn't even frown. He just stood at her side and said, "So fix it." She didn't sleep for 3 days. She examined every seam under a microscope, traced every line of rubber and steel. Finally, she saw it, the antenna seal. Correct material, wrong shape. Too weak for the pressure. She redesigned it, molded it herself, built a second prototype. When that one survived 30 minutes underwater and came out broadcasting perfectly, Master Chief Peterson, stern, seasoned, a man not prone to compliments, nodded once and said, "Best I've ever tested." Sarah nearly cried. Word spread quickly. Her name began to circulate in whispers among operators, the quiet technician who could do the impossible. Her workshop changed, too. It wasn't just a corner building anymore, it became a hub. SEALs stopped by with requests, ideas, even impossible dreams. Radios that could survive Arctic freezes. GPS units that could pass for rocks. Each time Sarah listened, each time she tried. And with every project, the weight grew. The knowledge that failure wasn't just failure, it could be the reason someone didn't come home. At night, she lay awake in her apartment, staring at the ceiling, the silence pressing on her again. Only now it wasn't the silence of being unseen. It was the silence of knowing too much. She was proud, but she was also afraid. And sometimes, when exhaustion blurred her vision, she wondered if she was enough. On one of those nights, Thompson stopped by the workshop long after hours. She was still at her bench, hunched over a mess of wires. He didn't speak at first. He just set a paper cup of coffee next to her and leaned against the wall. "You should rest," he said. "I can't," Sarah muttered, rubbing her eyes. "Because you're afraid to fail." She looked up sharply. "If I fail, they die." The words came out harsher than she intended, but he didn't flinch. He stepped closer, his voice low, almost quiet enough to be drowned by the hum of the equipment. "Then don't fail," he said. "But don't break yourself either. You're no good to anyone if you burn out." Sarah held his gaze, something unspoken passing between them, a flicker of understanding, a recognition that this wasn't just about wires and radios. It was about the human cost on both sides. For the first time, she realized she wasn't carrying this weight alone. And though she wouldn't admit it, not yet, not even to herself, she felt safer knowing he was there. Why did the folder feel heavier than its weight? The lieutenant laid it on her workbench with care, but Sarah could tell this wasn't routine. The paper was thick, the cover stamped with red letters she had only ever seen in movies, classified. When Mike Thompson spoke, his voice was steady, but his eyes told the truth. This mission wasn't like the others. Reconnaissance, hostile territory, underground tunnels. His words landed like stones. They'll be cut off from satellites. Standard radios won't penetrate the rock. We need something new. Sarah stared at the diagrams. Solid earth, subterranean chambers, communication chains broken by weight and silence. Every instinct told her the same thing: impossible. She almost said it out loud. But then she saw his expression, not the hardened officer's mask, but the flicker of trust beneath it. Trust placed in her hands, her mind, her stubborn refusal to quit. So she swallowed the word and nodded instead. "I'll find a way." The days that followed blurred into one another. Sarah studied underground physics, signal behaviors, geological interference. She learned that rock swallowed radio waves like water swallowing light. Satellites were useless, bouncing signals off empty skis while soldiers waited in darkness. Her solution came in fragments, sketches scattered across her desk. A relay chain, devices small enough to carry, strong enough to boost, clever enough to hide. One feeding into the next, until the message climbed from underground to the surface, then up to satellites in command. She built prototypes the size of smartphones, disguised as rocks or scraps of wood. She gave them solar panels, camouflaged shells, batteries that could last for days. But theory meant nothing without testing. In a mock tunnel system beneath the base, Sarah deployed her chain of relays, her heart racing as the signal flickered through. The first test failed, too weak, too hungry for power. The devices drained themselves within hours. Her hands shook when she held the dead units, the silence around her screaming failure. "You can quit," her mind whispered. "No one would blame you." But then she remembered the plaque on her wall, the salute, the phone call that had saved men in the fog. She went back to the bench. Nights blurred into dawns, coffee cups piled higher than the solder spools. Her fingers grew numb from rewiring circuits so small she could barely see them. She redesigned amplifiers, shaped antennas to catch whispers of signals through the earth. She built, tested, failed, rebuilt. And every time she felt the weight of collapse, he was there. Mike brought meals when she forgot to eat. He leaned against her doorframe, offering quiet words that steadied her. Sometimes he just sat in silence, watching her work, his presence enough to remind her she wasn't alone. "You're not just building devices," he told her once, voice soft. "You're building lifelines, don't forget that." At last, after 3 weeks of grinding labor, the second round of tests began. Sarah stood in the dim tunnel, sweat dampening her shirt, heart hammering as the devices lit one by one. A signal climbed the chain, from the darkness beneath the earth to the bright sky above. Clear, strong. It worked. For a moment she didn't believe it. She stared at the screen, at the words scrolling across. Transmissions intact, chain complete. Relief washed through her so hard her knees nearly buckled. Commander Sarah Williams, one of the few female SEAL officers, tested the gear herself. Stern, sharp-eyed, she placed the relays like stones marking a trail. When the system held, she turned to Sarah with a rare nod of approval. "This will save us," she said. Sarah almost cried. But the relief didn't last. Days before the mission, intelligence brought new fears. Enemy forces had detection systems, machines that could sniff out electronic signals, no matter how well hidden. Sarah's devices, though camouflaged to the eye, might light up like beacons to enemy scanners. If discovered, the mission would collapse. Sarah had 48 hours. She didn't leave the workshop. She worked until her eyes blurred, until her hands cramped so badly she could barely hold her tools. She redesigned the frequencies, layered the circuits with countermeasures, cloaked the signals like whispers under a storm. Her world shrank to wires and code, fear and resolve. Failure wasn't an option, not anymore. Mike stayed through it all. He fetched tools, ran tests, kept her awake when exhaustion pulled at her. His calm steadiness was the rope she clung to while the storm raged. 6 hours before deployment, the final test came. The devices hummed to life, invisible to detection equipment, signals passing clean through rock and silence. They had done it. The SEAL team gathered their gear. Commander Williams shook Sarah's hand, her grip firm, her eyes fierce. "This may be the difference between living and dying down there," she said. Sarah nodded, her throat too tight to speak. When the others left, Mike lingered. He studied her with an intensity that made her heart ache. "We'll be fine," he said, but she could hear the truth in his voice. He wasn't promising safety. He was promising trust. And then he was gone. Sarah sat alone in her workshop, the hum of silence louder than ever. Her devices were out there now, buried in hostile earth, carrying whispers of men whose lives hung on her design. She told herself not to think about it, not to imagine the tunnels, the enemies, the shadows, but she couldn't help it. Her hands, her mind, her sleepless nights, they were with them now. The waiting began. Hours stretched into days. Sarah tried to work, but her mind spun circles around the mission. She jumped at every phone call, every knock on the door. Mr. Johnson noticed her nerves, tried to distract her with projects, but nothing cut through the gnawing fear. On the fourth day, an unexpected visitor arrived. Admiral Harrison himself stepped into her workshop. Sarah's heart stopped. High-ranking officers didn't come here. She rose quickly, her hands trembling. But the Admiral wasn't here with reprimands. His expression carried weight, but not anger. "Your system is working," he told her, "flawlessly. The team has established full communication underground. They're sending intelligence we couldn't get any other way. You've given them a lifeline, Martinez." Sarah's knees nearly gave out. Relief crashed into her like a wave. But then came his warning. "The mission is about to get harder. They're being hunted. If the link fails, they'll be cut off. We're relying on you." That night Sarah lay awake, her body exhausted but her mind racing. She replayed every seal, every circuit, every choice. Had she overlooked something? Would the chain hold when it mattered most? And deep inside, she asked the question she couldn't silence. What if she had given them hope, only to watch it shatter? Why did the call come in the middle of the night? Sarah's phone buzzed against her nightstand, dragging her from shallow, restless sleep. Her chest tightened before she even saw the screen. Calls at this hour were never good news. The voice on the other end confirmed her fear. "Martinez," Master Chief Peterson said, his tone clipped, urgent. "One of your relay devices just went down. The chain's broken. They're isolated." Sarah sat up, heart pounding. "How bad?" "They can reach the nearest unit, but the signal's not climbing out. Command can't hear them. If they stay dark, they're on their own." Her throat dried. This wasn't a test. This wasn't simulation. This was happening right now, deep underground, with a team depending on her work. "What caused it?" she asked. "Unknown," Peterson said. "Could be interference, could be damage, doesn't matter. They need a workaround fast." Sarah was already pulling on clothes, her mind racing. She couldn't get to the device herself. She couldn't crawl through enemy territory, but she could guide them. Minutes later, she was in her workshop, hair pulled back, coffee steaming beside her. Screens lit the dark room as she patched into the partial signal still flickering from the field. Static filled her ears. Then a voice, faint, broken, "Commander Williams." "Repeat, relay down, isolated." Sarah swallowed hard, forcing calm into her voice. "Commander, this is Martinez. I'm here. You're not alone." The line crackled, then steadied. "We have one backup unit," Williams said, "but deploying it means moving. Risky." Sarah closed her eyes. She could picture it. Seals pressed against cold earth, enemy patrols combing the surface, every step a gamble. She wanted to tell them not to go, to stay safe. But she knew the truth. Without the chain, the mission was already dying. She opened her eyes. Her voice was steady now. "You'll need to bypass the failed relay. Place the backup 300 meters west. Use the slope, less interference there. Keep the antenna low. Test before you move further." There was a pause. Then Williams's voice again, firm, resolute. "Copy that, moving now." And then silence. 4 hours stretched like 4 lifetimes. Sarah stayed hunched over her equipment, listening to the emptiness, every second digging into her nerves. Peterson stood behind her, arms crossed, but even his stern mask couldn't hide the tension in his jaw. She imagined every possibility: a device dropped, a team ambushed, a wrong wire. She tried to push the thoughts away, but they kept clawing back, each one whispering the same accusation: "If they die, it's because of you." Finally, the static broke. "Martinez, do you copy?" Her breath caught. "I'm here." "The backup's in place, testing now." Seconds dragged. Then the signal spiked, clear, strong, climbing the chain all the way to command. Relief crashed over her, so hard she had to grip the table to stay upright. "Signal's live," she confirmed, her voice trembling despite her effort to steady it. "You're connected, you're safe." A pause, then Williams's voice, softer now. "You saved us." Sarah leaned back in her chair, tears stinging her eyes. For the first time in hours, she breathed. But the relief was laced with something sharper, because she had learned a truth she could never forget. No matter how careful she was, no matter how many redundancies she built, something could always fail. And when it did, lives dangled by a thread. When the mission finally ended 2 days later, the SEALs returned. Exhausted, dirt-streaked, but alive. Sarah waited at the debriefing, her hands fidgeting in her lap. Commander Williams was the first to greet her. She clasped Sarah's hand firmly, her voice low but heavy with meaning. "Your system kept us alive. We owe you." Sarah nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Then the failed relay was placed in her hands. Scarred, dented, a corner blackened with impact. Shrapnel damage, they explained. A random fragment of old artillery buried in the earth. Nothing she could have predicted. But still the sight of it cut deep. Because no matter how random, no matter how unavoidable, the failure had nearly cost lives. As the team dispersed, Mike found her standing alone. His uniform was dusty, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. But when he looked at her, something in him softened. "You saved us," he said quietly. Sarah shook her head. One of the relays failed if I had. He cut her off gently. If you hadn't designed a backup, we wouldn't be standing here. You didn't fail. You planned for the impossible, and it worked. Her eyes burned. She wanted to believe him, wanted to let the pride outweigh the fear, but the weight of responsibility pressed too hard. Still, when he touched her arm, steady and reassuring, a flicker of calm broke through. Later that night, alone in her workshop, Sarah studied the broken relay under a microscope. She traced the scar where the shrapnel had torn through. She cataloged the damage, noted every weakness, because failure, even unavoidable, was still a lesson. And she swore she would never let it happen again. But deep down, she knew the truth. In war, something always failed. The only question was whether you were ready when it did. Why did the invitation feel more like a summons than an honor? The letter bore the Pentagon's seal, delivered by hand, its language polished and formal. Sarah Martinez was requested to present her innovations in military communications to senior leadership in Washington, D.C. A civilian technician from a quiet workshop, suddenly called to stand before admirals, generals, and officials who moved nations with their decisions. When she held the paper, her hands trembled. She wanted to feel proud. She wanted to hear her father's voice in her head saying, "I knew you could do this." And yet, what she felt instead was a knot tightening in her chest, because this wasn't just recognition. It was exposure. No more hiding in corners. No more anonymity. Mike noticed it in her face when he found her sitting alone, staring at the letter. "They're not asking," he said gently. "They're telling you the truth. They need you." "Need me?" Sarah's laugh was quiet, bitter. "I fix radios, I patch wires. I've been making it up as I go. They'll see that, they'll know." Mike leaned closer, his eyes steady. "No, they'll see what I see. Someone who refuses to quit. Someone who saves lives without pulling a trigger." His words settled inside her like warmth against cold, but the fear didn't leave. Washington was everything her workshop was not: bright, sharp, filled with polished shoes and perfect uniforms. Standing at the podium, Sarah felt painfully out of place. She wore her best clothes, but compared to the medals and stars glittering in the room, she felt invisible again. Until she started speaking. Her voice was shaky at first. She stumbled over technical terms, her hands gripping the edges of the podium. But then, as she described the relay system, the late nights, the failures, the solutions, the words steadied. She spoke not just of circuits and antennas, but of the human cost, of what it meant when silence stretched where voices should have been. The room listened. Questions came, sharp and probing. Could the technology scale? Could it withstand Arctic temperatures, desert heat, jungle moisture? Sarah answered each one carefully, her knowledge flowing from lived experience rather than rehearsed notes. When it ended, she expected polite applause at best. Instead, a four-star general approached her directly, his handshake firm, his words simple but heavy. "You've changed the way we fight." The recognition should have filled her with pride. But when she returned to Coronado, her chest still carried the same weight. Because every compliment, every handshake, every commendation was another reminder. More teams would depend on her now. More lives tethered to her designs. And if something failed again, the blood would feel like hers. Her reputation grew fast. Requests flooded in: Arctic missions, desert patrols, classified operations she wasn't allowed to hear the details of. Her workshop expanded, technicians assigned under her leadership, secure storage areas added. Where once she worked in silence, now she was at the center of a hive. But late at night, when the noise quieted, doubt crept back. She thought about the broken relay scarred by shrapnel, about the endless variables she couldn't control. And the more recognition she received, the more she feared the fall. Mike saw it in her. He always did. One evening, after another long day, she sat slumped at her bench, staring at a half-finished Arctic radio. Her hands were still, her mind heavy. Mike stepped in quietly, placing a cup of tea beside her instead of coffee this time. "You're burning out," he said softly. Sarah shook her head. "I can't stop. If I slow down, if I miss something." "Then you're human," he interrupted, "not a machine." She met his gaze, anger flickering. Machines don't cry themselves to sleep. Machines don't wonder if they're enough. His expression softened. He stepped closer, his voice low. "No, they don't, but machines don't care either. You do. That's the difference. That's why they trust you." The words broke something inside her. Tears slipped down her cheeks before she could stop them. She turned away, ashamed, but Mike reached out, his hand gentle on her shoulder. "You don't have to carry this alone," he said. For the first time, Sarah let herself lean into that truth, just for a moment, just long enough to breathe. Weeks later, when she traveled to Alaska to test her Arctic designs, Mike was there too. He was leading the team preparing for deployment, and suddenly the stakes felt sharper. It wasn't just about soldiers depending on her equipment, it was him. The cold was brutal, biting through every layer of clothing, freezing breath in the air. Sarah's radios failed again and again at first, batteries draining, circuits freezing. Each failure cut deep, the fear doubling when she imagined Mike's life hanging on her work. But she refused to quit. She redesigned, added tiny heating coils, built insulated cases meant to trap body warmth. She tested them in snowbanks, left them overnight in the biting wind, pushed them until her fingers were numb. And at last they worked. Clear signals at 40 below, strong connections even in storms. When the mission launched, Mike carried her designs into the Arctic. Sarah waited, sleepless, counting hours, each tick of the clock a blade. And when he returned, alive, smiling, safe, her knees nearly buckled with relief. He found her in the hangar, pulled off his gloves, and pressed her frozen hands between his. "You kept us alive," he said simply. This time she didn't argue. She let the pride bloom, quiet but real. Because for once, she wasn't invisible. And yet, deep inside, she still wondered, how long could she carry the weight before it broke her? Why did his words echo long after the briefing ended? The mission folders had been spread across the table, maps littered with coded marks, commanders leaning over them with measured voices. Sarah sat at the far end, not in uniform, not with rank, but still invited, because her designs had become inseparable from the operations themselves. But this time was different. The request wasn't just about keeping men alive. It wasn't radios to cut through storms or GPS to guide them through fog. It was something sharper, a system designed to intercept and disrupt enemy signals, to not just protect but to control. "Think of it as a fence through silence," one officer said. "If we can sever their communications mid-operation, they're blind. They're ours." The room murmured with approval. Sarah's stomach twisted. She nodded mechanically, writing notes, but inside she felt the unease rising like a tide. Until now, every design had been about lifelines, keeping voices alive in the dark, connecting men to safety. But this was different. This was about power, about turning silence into a weapon. Later, alone in her workshop, she sat with the diagrams. Wires, frequencies, amplifiers, all doable, all within reach. And yet her hand hovered above the page, unmoving. When Mike walked in, she didn't look up. She didn't want him to see the storm in her face. "You're quiet," he said softly. She let out a brittle laugh. "For someone who builds communication systems, I'm not very good at words right now." He stepped closer, watching her. "What's wrong?" "They want me to design something to shut the enemy down," she said. "Not just survive, not just protect, to dominate." Mike was silent for a long moment. Then, "And you don't want to?" Her throat tightened. "I want to keep people alive, not this." He leaned against the bench, arms folded. His voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. "Sarah, war isn't just about surviving. It's about ending the fight before it ends you." The words stung. She wanted to argue, wanted to tell him that making silence into a weapon wasn't who she was. But then she remembered the plaque, the salute, the countless faces she'd never met depending on her work to breathe another day. And so, against the knot in her chest, she picked up her pen. Days turned into nights again. She designed jammers small enough to carry, strong enough to cut through hostile frequencies. She layered in failsafes, countermeasures, disguises. The work was brilliant, efficient, everything they had asked for. But each time the circuits lit, Sarah felt a piece of herself dim. When testing began, the SEALs marveled at the results. Enemy signals blinked out on the screens, their voices cut off, their coordination severed. To them, it was a victory. To Sarah, it was a silence that felt too familiar, too final. Mike saw it in her, always he saw it. After one long day, she sat outside the hangar, staring at the sunset bleeding across the bay. He joined her, quiet at first. "You hate it," he said finally. Sarah nodded. "Because I've turned their silence into hours. I don't know if I crossed a line." He looked at her for a long time, then spoke with a softness she hadn't heard before. "Every war is built on lines, and every person has to decide where theirs is." His words didn't give her peace, but they gave her truth. And in that truth, she found something else. She wasn't just building machines anymore. She was wrestling with the soul of what she created. That night when she lay awake, she realized the bond between her and Mike wasn't just about respect or trust or the unspoken pull that had grown between them. It was about the way he steadied her when she faltered, the way he didn't shield her from hard truths but stood with her in them. Their relationship deepened quietly, naturally, as if it had always been meant to. Dinners shared not as commander and technician, but as two people finding common ground. Stories of childhood, his mountains in Colorado, her dusty Texas evenings. Laughter over old movies, silences that didn't need filling. But beneath the warmth, Sarah still carried the weight. Every new project, every new mission, every new silence she built. The world saw her as a rising star, a civilian technician who had become indispensable to special operations. But Sarah knew the cost. Nights when sleep wouldn't come. Days when the weight in her chest made her hands tremble over wires. And yet, every time doubt threatened to break her, she remembered the faces. The gratitude in Williams's eyes, the sound of Rodriguez's laugh when the radios worked flawlessly, the quiet nod of Master Chief Peterson, rare but real. And always the salute. Because sometimes dignity didn't speak, it simply acted. Sarah wasn't sure anymore if she was saving lives or changing wars. Maybe both, maybe neither, but she knew one truth that anchored her, even as storms rose around her. She mattered, and she had no choice now but to carry that weight. Why did the silence feel different now? For months, silence had meant fear. It had meant waiting in the workshop for signals that might never come, meant wondering if her designs had failed, if lives had been lost in the dark because of a wire she hadn't soldered tight enough. Silence had been the enemy. But tonight, standing on the beach as waves lapped against the sand, the silence felt like something else. It felt like arrival. Mike had asked her to meet him there. He stood with his shoes in his hand, the tide brushing his boots, the salt wind pushing at his hair. When Sarah approached, he turned, and in his eyes she saw something she hadn't expected to see in his vulnerability. He didn't speak at first. He just reached into his pocket, pulled out a small box, and opened it. Inside was a ring, simple, silver, but with a single detail that made her chest tighten. The band carried a tiny inlay of metal from the first radio she had repaired for his team. "Sarah," he said, his voice low, raw, "we've fought so hard to keep others alive. I want us to fight for this for us." Her breath caught. The tide pulled at the sand beneath her feet, grounding her in the moment. And before doubt could find its way in, she nodded. Tears blurred her vision as she whispered, "Yes." The applause that followed at their wedding weeks later was small, private. No cameras, no headlines. Just family, teammates, commanders who had seen the quiet partnership between them grow into something unshakable. Admiral Harrison himself officiated, his voice rough with emotion as he spoke of service, resilience, and love forged in the crucible of responsibility. Sarah stood in her dress, holding Mike's hands, her heart so full she thought it might break. For years, she had wondered if she belonged, if she mattered. Now, in that small room filled with people who trusted her not just with their equipment but with their lives, she knew she did. But her story didn't end there. The work grew bigger. Her workshop expanded into a full research center, a team of technicians under her leadership, engineers who looked to her for guidance. Sarah guided them not with bravado but with humility. She reminded them that wires weren't just wires, that circuits weren't just circuits. They were threads connecting lives. Every new project carried its own storms: Arctic radios, desert-proof GPS, stealth jammers. Each success brought recognition. Each failure, when it came, carried the sting of guilt. Sarah never escaped the weight. She only learned to bear it differently. She no longer tried to carry it alone. Mike was there, not just as a SEAL, but as a partner. He had transferred to training command, trading deployments for stability, shaping the next generation of SEALs while staying by her side. He became the bridge between her work and the warriors who carried it. Together, they became something neither could have been alone. Sometimes, in the quiet after long days, they would walk the base, watching recruits run drills in the distance. Mike would point out their stumbles, their triumphs. Sarah would smile, remembering how once, not long ago, she had watched those same drills from the window of her tiny workshop, wondering if she would ever matter. Now, she mattered more than she had ever imagined. But it wasn't medals or recognition that defined her. It was the memory of voices breaking through static. It was the relief of signals climbing from darkness to light. It was the knowledge that somewhere, thousands of miles away, someone lived because a circuit held. Still, the moral conflict never disappeared. She had built tools that saved lives and tools that severed enemy voices, leaving silence in their place. Some nights, the weight of that duality pressed against her chest. But Mike's words stayed with her. Every war is built on lines, and every person has to decide where theirs is. Sarah learned that her line was this: she would build, she would innovate, she would carry the weight. But she would never forget the faces behind the wires. She would never let herself see her work as just machines. Because it was dignity woven into circuits. It was resilience soldered into place. Years later, when recruits asked her how she started, she would tell them about a broken GPS, a late night in a silent workshop, and a salute she never expected. She would tell them how small moments, moments that seemed invisible, could change everything. And when she stood at the edge of the sea, watching the horizon with Mike at her side, she felt something she had never allowed herself to feel before: peace. Not because the weight had vanished, but because she had learned to carry it. Her story wasn't about glory. It wasn't about battles won or enemies defeated. It was about a quiet woman who thought she was invisible until she discovered that sometimes the strongest acts of service aren't loud at all. Their steady hands, sleepless nights, circuits soldered under trembling fingers. Their silence, not as absence but as presence. And as the tide rose and fell against the shore, Sarah understood the truth she had been searching for all along. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.